we're going to roll straight into this third panel, and then we will have a 15-minute break at the conclusion of panel 3, which is on California's cost to build. And while our panelists are leaving and our new panelists are coming up, I'm going to say a word or two about this panel as well as our panelists for this session. So we've already started to hear about rights-of-way, about costs, about budgets, and this session is designed to really drill into a controversy that got raised to applause in our first session, the high cost of permitting, the issues around rights-of-way, the issues around regulation. So this session will consider the cost to build and the legal clearance for deploying and maintaining broadband infrastructure along public routes and how we can get better broadband both in the last mile as well as the middle mile. Just a little bit of programming announcements about our panelists. One of the panelists, Dane Jasper, unfortunately has come down with COVID, but is obviously recovering and is not in a position to travel and be here. So we're going to excuse Dane from being here, but a disappointment. Roger Timmerman, on the other hand, is on the tarmac, or is hopefully close to the tarmac, if not off the tarmac. So we are expecting him here, I don't know, maybe halfway through this session. I'll say a word about Roger in just a second. Let me introduce our moderator, and I'm really pleased that Greg Lucas has gone a little bit out of his comfort zone and joined us. He's the California State Librarian, and he's got some great stories. Obviously before being a librarian, but now as the California State Librarian, and how that relates to broadband. And he was appointed California's 25th State Librarian by Governor Jerry Brown in 2014, and prior to that, he was the Capitol Bureau Chief for the San Francisco Chronicle, where he covered politics and policy here at the state capitol for 20 years. And as the state librarian, his priorities have been to improve reading skills, to put library cards in the hand of every school kid, and to provide Californians the information they need, no matter what community they live in. I'll also just introduce our panelists that are here thus far. Lori Adams is the Vice President of Broadband Policy and Funding Strategy at Nokia, and she has a very deep reservoir of experience in this space and the space of the last panel, right? She actually was instrumental or responsible for building a middle mile network in Maryland. And now in her role at Nokia, she is responsible for developing strategies and tools to enable increased participation in state, federal, and international programs through infrastructure deployments. And she's also a telecom attorney and has had extensive experience in both the government and the private sector. Our second panelist, Bill Higgins, is the Executive Director of California Association of Councils of Government, and CalCog, which he's been part of for 13 years. Prior to that, he spent 11 years as a senior staff attorney, program manager, and legislative representative for the League of California Cities and its nonprofit affiliate, the Institute of Local Government. And so he's a regionalist. I love that phrase from his bio. And obviously that's a key part of broadband infrastructure, building, and the problems. And again, since I do hope Roger will be with us, I will say just a bit about him. He's the executive director of UTOPIA Fiber, and he's been serving as its executive director since 2016. And has really been quite energetic and responsible for UTOPIA emerging as a viable model, and more than that, a role model for many, many projects, both last mile and, as we heard from our last panel, middle mile around the country. He's an engineering guy by nature. Previously, he was Vice President of Engineering for Vivint Wireless, as well as iProvo. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our moderator, Greg Lucas, and look forward to a discussion that hopefully will be joined in a little while. So, Greg.
Thank you, Drew. I just wish it could be a little brighter up here.
I know. Or I brought my cool shades. Well, thank you all for being here.
We're going to talk about the costs of building in California. And we've got, the thing on the stage says we got about 41 minutes to do it, of which we're going to leave some time for questions from you all. So let's begin, and you can jump in. Is it more expensive to do these kind of projects we've been talking about all day in California?
You go. You can compare Maryland.
Well, I mean, you know, the cost to build in 2024 is going to be more expensive, right? No matter what state you're in. There are, you know, but it is not just the time and the cost of labor. It's compliance, it's permitting, it's fees and other layering on of requirements and things that add to costs. And so California is notoriously a more expensive, difficult place to build for those reasons. And, you know, I don't have any one-to-one comparisons on that, but, you know, if you hear from industry, you hear around that, well, we, you know, California has a lot of money, there's so much need, but it's really hard to do business there from a network standpoint, from a build standpoint, from a deployment standpoint. And so, you know, these factors all kind of add up to sort of point to that anecdotal yes.
But just in the brief time we were talking back here while they were putting the microphones on, I mean, you were describing a project that you worked on in Maryland that sounded like it had some of the same, you know, hurdles, let's say, or elements, right, that you would have in California.
So, you know, I mean,
different rules
yes.
for different localities.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, so 15 years ago, I mean, if we sort of take a big giant step back, because, you know, this is...
Okay, wait, did everyone take a giant step back? Okay.
This is, go back in your time machine.
Take
to
another step back.
2009, the, you know, economic crash of 2009, 8 and 9. And the first round of stimulus money and infrastructure projects that were passed through the Obama administration to help offset the recession, the Great Recession. And at that time, there were, you know, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act put $4 billion worth of money into broadband. And it was the first time that had happened at that level. And $4 billion felt like the $42 billion that we have now for BEAD. You know, I can assure you. And what was unique about that $4 billion is that it was primarily driven towards middle mile infrastructure. You know, that was kind of the goal, because the thought process was that if we're investing in the middle mile infrastructure and we're creating these spoke and wheel network architectures in the states, then there will be investment and further build to come leveraging that infrastructure. And that was kind of the rationale for it. Did that happen? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. But what was unique about that program was that the NTIA was the first time they had administered a program, gave money to every state. There was at least one project in every state. And so I wrote the grant and directed the project for the state of Maryland, which was entirely owned and operated by municipal governments throughout the state of Maryland. And that project was completed in 2013. And so if you've ever tried to collect matching funds from 9 government jurisdictions, cash payments, permitting challenges, you know, I had 6 months of my life with negotiating pole attachment agreements with county government offices of law who didn't understand that fiber was a long-term technology. It was, you know, there were a lot of challenges back then. This is not a new challenge, right? Here we are, 2024. Within those last 10 years, the emphasis on middle mile has actually fallen aside in place of the emphasis to reach last mile. However, we still have a tremendous need for middle mile infrastructure. And I applaud California for doing the hard thing, which is making sure that there is infrastructure that is going to be owned and operated within the state for this purpose, because not many states have done that, and it is sorely needed. But you know, the challenges are not new, but the sort of the conversations are the same. And so I think in a dozen years, you know, we haven't yet really progressed to the point where we have solutions for how to easily streamline permitting, for how to easily reduce costs, for how to ease the deployment challenges.
Thank you. Bill, how can regional governments help address some of those issues?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you to everybody. And it's nice to be in here, not in 107 degrees outside.
Oh, come on. Sacramento has the best average temperature in California. It's 35 in the winter, it's 110 in the summer, and the average is very nice.
Well, we like that. But I am cognizant that there are a number of workers out there today that need water and shade, and we appreciate their efforts. Look, there's a couple of things I just want to respond to generally, because I'm, even though I represent regional governments here today, and I've worked with local governments this morning, I haven't spent much time at a permitting desk. But my experience with permitting is everybody hates permitting for their own business, but they kind of understand it for other places, because usually permits are for a public purpose. And I think in these kind of conversations, we can kind of forget that there are reasons that they're in place. Sometimes they're annoying, but sometimes there's some public value there too. And there can be a better balance. And you asked me what regional governments are doing, and I can point to the Southern California Association of Governments, which is the 6 counties in Southern California working with SANDAG, the San Diego area. And they're working on coming up with a joint region-wide ordinance and process that all 211 cities in those 7 counties down there can use. And this will be particularly the smaller cities that don't have the capacity to set up and set one of these processes up right away. You know, and for a city, the permits, you know, it seems very annoying until, you know, until that encroachment permit that allowed a contractor to trench on a public road that wasn't paved over right enough and created a pothole that 3 years led to an auto accident where somebody died, then the local council member has that responsibility. And it's those kind of values that they're looking at, just like any private company wouldn't let a public agency on their land to do projects without a lot of liabilities and certainties. Railroads do that all the time to public agencies. So there's a reason for it, and I mean it can be more efficient, but I don't agree with the permit bashing. Let's just say I think that there's a reason, and it can be, and we can hold it to a better account.
What was the model ordinance you said?
It's coming out. It's not published yet. They've been working on it. I understand it's from some sources. It's coming. They've been working on it for a while. But one thing that a region can do, of course, is
the ordinance does what?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. It's supposedly for local agencies, and I haven't read through it, but it's. So a local agency has the same ordinance, like 3 or 4 or 5, 10, they all have the same ordinance, the same standards. So when industry comes in and says, we're gonna lay this fiber or do whatever, you're running off the same set of criteria across the several cities. So, and that makes sense in that context. I'll just add that, again, we're talking about California, and California's a really big state. And I would ponder to guess that SCAG is bigger than Maryland. And so it makes some sense that they may have their own system that's different than the Bay Area or the San Joaquin Valley, which is, you know, the population of West Virginia and larger than West Virginia. So it makes some sense that we would have some different systems in the state.
But some consistency over a region that has 211 different cities in it is an improvement over dealing with 211 cities.
Totally. Okay. Totally. Yeah. I mean, and I think what this ordinance tried to do, and you jump in and get me at any time, but I mean, there are a lot of different systems, and whether it's wireless, and this is at the edge of my knowledge, so I'm not going to know whether it's wireless or, you know, there's all these different systems and trade-offs with everything that's coming to them. And I know that this model ordinance tried to help the public agencies think that through.
You know, I think local governments actually get a lot of heat for, right? And I'm not sure it's warranted in a lot of cases because, you know, our experience, at least in the Maryland project, was that the local government permitting level was not the problem. And, you know, you hear a lot, there's a lot of rules that govern different deployments, whether it's wireless deployments, you know, pole attachments, et cetera, and certain things. There are shot clocks that are in place for wireless. The biggest challenge, and this has been the case for the last 20 plus years has been federally controlled access highways, State Department of Transportation's, and federal agency permits. And I'm talking about like, for federal agency permits, like the Bureau, land, forest,
Land management.
land management, right? If you need an easement through a right of way and it goes through a federal park, if you need to cross a train track, God forbid, a lot of us probably in this room have dealt with have some scars from that. So it's not, the local government piece is really important, and it's critical to have structure and rules and processes and streamlining, but it's, from a holistic standpoint, right? You're talking about an ecosystem of permitting.
Is the federal and state processes, have they improved since in the past 12 years? I mean, no one's ever accused government of moving like Amazon, right?
Correct.
So,
I can tell you a story, and I can tell you this because it's been 15 years. So
the statute is run?
Right, yeah, the statute is run, right? The governors are long gone now and everything, so we're completely different people. But when we were building out in Maryland, we had a grant from the Department of Homeland Security to close a critical loop in the state network infrastructure, and it was basically, maybe like a 20-mile stretch of fiber that we needed to build to close a ring. So it was a redundant ring. So it was a really critical path for us. And what happened was it took me 3 years to try to negotiate an easement with the state to close their own network loop, because the State Department of Transportation kept trying to ask us for things, because it was going to be an easement along a federally controlled access highway. They wanted fiber strands, they wanted revenue share off of money for commercial activity, they wanted all of these sorts of things, and we're like, we just want to put 20 miles of fiber here. And so what happened at the end of 3 years was that we re-engineered the route to take it off of a federally controlled access highway, and we put it on a state road. So that was 3 years of time lost, and we almost lost the money from the grant for that particular segment.
Because the clock had run.
Because the clock was running out. And then, so once we made that decision, then the state was like, well, how do we get that route back? And we're like, what do you mean? We're building it, we're just not doing it off of the highway. And so I think, there's a lot of challenges with this. There aren't, especially with some of these federal roads and easements, and and I'm not sure what has improved over the last 20 years, because you can find examples and cases to prove or disprove that theory. But it is a challenge, and it is still a persistent challenge.
I just was going to point out, I think our next panelist here is going to come, so if we want to diss him before he's here, we should do it.
This would be the time to do it. Yeah.
I think, I'm sure he can't hear us back there.
I'm sure. Well, I was just going to ask, so in terms of regional governments, and was this something that they've been working on in the past, or is sort of broadband a newer kind of, we need to bring some?
It's newer, and a lot of, I'd say almost every region cares. A lot of our regions don't, the two regions I mentioned are two that have some of the most resources in the state. And some of our smaller regions really don't have, they could use another staff person or two just to finish the transportation planning mandate that they have.
Right.
And so, even though their elected officials are saying, yes, we should do something, there's not a capacity for them to take the leadership role that has happened in Southern California as much. And in this region, Trish Kelly, the former moderator, works with Valley Vision.
Right.
And they've done such a remarkable job in the region, and I know that they talk to the Sacramento Area Council of Governments a lot, but SACOG hasn't. Actually, I call them SACOG because, but I've heard the kids started calling them the SAC OG, which is really cool. But anyway, they haven't. Oh yeah, there you go. Yay!
Sorry about that.
That's right. Welcome. We were just talking about you.
Uh-oh.
So the answer, if I talk to Mendocino Council of Governments, for example, This matters to them because they have a lot of rural areas that are poorly connected and out in the Round Valley Indian Reservation. But they don't have the staff capacity to do it because their executive director is also installing road counters on their highways because they just don't have that much staff.
Right, but so part of the benefit then of creating this consistency for them is that they don't have the capacity to do it anyway.
But they would still have to adapt it to their circumstances, so they'd need some capacity to be able to offer it. I mean, they might be able to pull some stuff out of Southern California, but Fort Bragg is not Pasadena, so.
Ooh, this just in. Lucky we're all sitting down. Truly, it's not.
No, it isn't.
I just wanted to change before we pick on our new panelists. Aren't there factors that are kind of outside of California's or any state's control? I mean, aren't we still having sort of, what do they call it, the supply chain issues and things like that? Or is that just a red herring?
So let me answer it this way. So I work for Nokia, right? Earlier this year, we announced a couple months ago that we now have U.S. manufacturing in the United States available for the BEAD program and for other funded programs that have a Buy America preference. And so, we've spent a lot of time talking about supply chains. COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, absolutely, right? We all know what the challenges were there. The challenges now with supply chain is not so much the availability, it's the demand. And right now, the delay is not due to, there aren't any normal delays in the normal course of business. It's business as usual right now. But I know earlier this morning, we were talking from panelists about 50 states worth of BEAD infrastructure projects being launched simultaneously.
Right.
That is going to put a strain on the system, right? Whether it's labor, whether it's fiber, whether it's you name it, it is going to create challenges with supply chains, with from everything from people all the way down to conduit. So it's not so much a red herring. It just needs to be mitigated as part of your planning processes. How you order materials, how you manage the flow of materials and assets and people, and when you lock in those resources, and how you estimate your costs. It can be managed and mitigated, so I wouldn't call it a red herring. It is a challenge, but it can be managed.
And so I would just, maybe a different twist on it. The way so our members have transportation modelers on staff, and these are people who, take data and estimate how much people drive every day and what and they have a whole language unto their own that I need an interpreter for, but they've taught me that the term is exogenous factor, right? Or something outside that you don't control.
It sounds better than it is, probably.
Totally. Yeah. But one of those that I think you just mentioned there's 50 states going to construction at the same time. In California, at the same time, over the last few years, we've made huge transportation investments. And at some level, there's some overlap in that job demand of like who's hiring and how much they have to pay. There's just starting another $5 billion going out on, intercity rail and bus projects. That's going to also, at some level, tap into the demand pool or the labor pool and just make everything more expensive.
Yeah, it's not specific to broadband.
Right.
We put out $500 million, almost $500 million in money to do long deferred maintenance on local public libraries. And within 6 months, right, every single project estimate that we'd gotten had gone up, so.
Yeah, so it's definitely a feast or famine.
Who are you?
I'm Roger Timmerman. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Before you answer the question, can you tell us a little bit about UTOPIA Fiber?
Yeah,
I remember Utah Telecommunications, and then I bogged down.
It is an acronym, but we just go with UTOPIA Fiber.
Okay, all right.
And we're outside of Utah now, so it
Right.
doesn't make a lot of sense to use the Utah name in it. But we're a consortium of municipalities. We were up to 23 citywide fiber to the home projects with a middle mile in about 70 other cities. We're in Utah, Idaho, and Montana right now, with growth planned for a lot of other areas. So, but we're a public entity, and we're the largest open access network in the country, which is where we build public infrastructure, and then we allow the private companies to come and use it. So there's a lot of debate of like public versus private, and we're kind of this interesting niche in the middle where it's a partnership, right? We put in public infrastructure that's pro-competition, pro-private sector, but removes the barriers of entry for private competition. So that's who we are.
You had something to say about supply chain.
Yeah. Supply chain's been interesting. COVID, everything kind of shut down, and yet demand skyrocketed. So that was like a perfect storm. And we and almost everybody in the industry was buying anything they could get from anyone. I mean, we had previously been ordering just Corning fiber, and we were like, we'll take OFS, we'll take Prismian, and they're great. All these other options, they'll work. But we were just trying to get supplies from anyone we could. And then, after a year or two, all the manufacturing caught up, and suddenly we had way more inventory than we needed. And that's consistent across the whole industry. Right now, there is a glut of inventory. A lot of people are sitting on that. I mean, we like to maintain a few $1 million worth of inventory, and we're at something like $10 to $12 million. But at the same time, we're like, there's all this bead coming, and it's going to swing back because everybody's going to get money at nearly the same time, and be scrambling for resources. And so some people are getting ahead of that and trying to stock some inventory early. You can't get too far ahead because you really need to be buying that from bead money versus replacing money. And so it's a tricky game of timing and where you have your inventory at. But yeah, I think we're definitely going to go into, I think currently most manufacturers and vendors are a little frustrated because they're seeing lower purchasing right now. But we all see this wave coming where things are going to skyrocket. It's something, there's not an easy solution to it because it's a timing thing. But another thing to be aware of is the mix is going to be very different. In the past, it was kind of just traditional build of, fiber to the home or fiber to everything through communities with a certain mix of electronics and splitters and enclosures and all that. But BEAD is going to trend severely rural. So you're going to be really consuming far more conduit and fiber cables than you are as much as you're going to see on the electronic side, right? It's going to be fewer ports for the amount of fiber and distances because it's going to push out into the $20,000 per household passed or something like that, whereas traditionally you'd see projects at only $3,000 per home passed type of thing because we're going further distances per port or per customer on those networks.
Have there been any of these federal sort of encouragement programs where they parcel it out over time? If the issue is, right, we're writing a big check now and everyone is asking for supplies, have there been any of these that are like, okay, here's phase one and in a couple of years we'll do phase two or?
No, I mean, traditionally, funding programs are allocated through legislative action, right? So they're appropriated in a bill, and that bill is passed into law, and that money is safeguarded over here, like for BEAD, for the broadband, for all the infrastructure bill, the IGIP money is all secured. It's been appropriated, and so the only thing I can think of at the moment where you have sort of a fund to draw from would be RDOF, and I hate to mention this program. It is not a great program. It has not been a great program for bridging the digital divide. Right, exactly. But RDOF was a $20 billion fund. And with some of the disqualifications and defaults, you're down to approximately $6.2 billion worth of funding that is being spent, and so there's $14 billion kind of hanging out with nowhere to go. And so whether there will be future rounds of RDOF remains to be seen. It depends on how successful BEAD is. But typically, these programs are, kind of a one and done, right? And then they will dump money into it as future funds get appropriated.
Just seems like maybe parceling it out over time might be strategically.
Now you're bringing logic into an
sorry,
argument.
I know there's a law you can use. No logic.
Unless you're concerned about getting elected, and then you want it out before an election.
Yeah, right.
I think there's going to be a lot of, try your best and ask for extensions and forgiveness. We've seen a lot of companies fail with the RDOF grants and getting those, getting penalties for failure to deliver, and those cause problems because those areas have become ineligible for BEAD, and yet they're under some other program where things aren't being delivered. So adding, infinite forgiveness on a program is actually very harmful if there's another program that could be benefiting those areas. So it's a delicate balance for the federal government and these programs to figure out how tight of timeframes do we have to you know,
That's a good point.
push them to get it done. But at the same time, it's really not practical to always hit your timelines. I mean, when you get into these, you know, permitting issues and just supply chain issues, it's going to be a problem to have this massive amount of money hitting all at the same time.
You know, the other problem is that when you have different programs layered on top of each other, you know, you really don't know what's being built. I mean, you know, this is part of what is going to be the California is going to have to do in their challenge process is figure out what locations are part of other funding programs that haven't been built yet. But the money is allocated. The location is part of that funding program. It's not eligible for BEAD. So if you start dumping all of these programs on top of each other, you have to sort that out to figure out what's truly unserved and what's truly underserved. And so that is a challenge. So, you know, to continually appropriate more money for more programs while all of this is in flight just makes it actually more difficult.
And who makes that determination?
Well, the state.
Governments, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that takes time.
It does.
But, is Utopia coming to California?
Not as Utopia. We're under an agreement with RCRC and Golden State Connect Authority to be an operating partner with them.
Right.
But it won't be Utopia Fiber here. It'll be just kind of in a support role and operations role with
Are there
them.
unique challenges to California?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, can you tell us what some of them are?
Well, geography without saying, right? I mean, we have variety of geography in Utah, everything from solid granite to sand to caliche to cobble to all these things, and obviously California has...
Well, and RCRC has some of the most challenging geography of any part of the state.
Absolutely.
Rural counties of California, right? RCRC? Okay.
So in every one of those areas, it's different, right? And we have to do an analysis of that. Permitting challenges, cost of materials, labor, requirements for contracting. There's requirements for different, you know, in your programs themselves have a lot of rules as far as requirements of contractors, what they have to meet, right? We can't just go out there and, you know, hire people off the street to build a network. We have to go through government procurement processes and comply with you know, different wage requirements and things like that. So there's a lot of layers of checking boxes that do make things more expensive in many ways, because not so much that we need to comply, but the contractors and process and everything complies, and that increases their costs. So it's doable. I think it is actually more doable in the rural areas. You know, there's less layers of bureaucracy to go through there because we are partnered with the counties themselves in that type of situation. But
the
California is still
building is
challenging.
more complicated though, right? In rural areas?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Well, it depends. I mean, there's almost a scale. The more urban you go, the more difficult it gets, and the more rural you get, the more difficult it gets, but in different ways, right? You get into congestion issues. So, you know, if I'm building in San Francisco, it's an absolute nightmare, right? Because they're just finding a space. You know, you go 20 feet and you're crossing 15 utilities, right? And so you're locating things, and the layers of inspection and permitting required in a very urban environment puts the costs and time through the roof, right? And then you get kind of out into like a suburban area where you have some relatively good density and not quite the congestion. That's kind of a sweet spot for costs. And then you get really rural, and it's like pretty easy to build. I mean, you can still have ground conditions, but the permitting challenges and obstacles aren't there as much as you have in suburban and urban. So you have distance issues, you know, you're more footage per house and all of that, but the difficulty of getting it built is easier. So it's kind of a curve, right?
Lori, were you going to say?
No, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, the urban and suburban, you know, and some suburban builds are hard, right? I mean, it's the permitting, you have the cost of you're digging up concrete and the sidewalks and the duct systems and the space that Roger was talking about. And then you also have, you know, traffic control and flags, and like, you know, you have to account for when you're doing the work. You have to do it at nighttime so you're not obstructing roadways. And so it's, you know, building in cities, and this is actually one of the reasons why there's a lot of gap areas in densely populated cities and urban areas where the take rate may not be as high, or the ability to pay for service may not be as high, and because it's challenging to get there.
We sort of established before your plane landed and you got here that it's a variety of factors, right, that contribute to the cost of doing broadband in California. Is there one thing, like they teach you in management school, like what's the most important thing to do right now, right? Is there a thing that California could do that would make a material difference in either bringing down the costs or speeding up these projects?
Potentially some standard process, rates for permits and kind of the shot clock type methodology.
Like the uniformity bill was talking about?
Well, he wasn't here when I was talking about that. And the Southern California regions are doing, they know, so I'll just tell you, that they're doing a kind of a universal or model ordinance that would be applied across the 7 counties.
Yeah, those types of efforts help a lot.
That's a plus. Okay.
I mean, over time it has gotten difficult, right? Different regulatory entities or counties or states or whatever have said, hey, here's another thing we'd like them to do when they build, and so here's another checkbox or here's another thing. In fact, literally on the plane here, I'm going through my emails, and our contractors were complaining because our Utah Department of Transportation is basically saying, we want all construction that goes on Utah roads, that state-owned roads, that we have to excavate and inspect before and after every sewer lateral that we cross. And this isn't a sewer main or anything like that, but a house lateral, like this isn't avoid it and go below it or under it, or know what you're doing and use your tools with your locating and drills. Really, their argument was, because there's been too many complaints about people hitting sewer lines and they're hard to figure out who is at fault and it may be years before anybody discovers it, we're going to make it hard on everyone every time, right? And those types of things are well-meaning, but when you say there's maybe a hit rate or failure rate of 0.01%, it does happen, right? But to then impose what might be a 5% increase of costs over the entire project to make sure that never happens is unreasonable. And over time, almost any entity that's in a permitting role has made it more difficult and more expensive to build broadband. And yet we're over here saying, hey, this is a crisis and we need to make this faster and easier and cheaper for people. It has not been the trend. It's not been the trend nationally or California or Utah or anywhere.
I was going to say, so I work in government. When you were describing this thing by the Utah Department of Transportation.
Did they learn that from you?
No, but what I heard was, what a great way to justify our budget. Like we have to do all this extra work to investigate the sewer laterals, right? Anyway.
I was going to say that for the local governments who are participating in these in these projects, the biggest thing you have working to your advantage, is economies of scale, and you can work together to achieve that. And instead of looking at it as an individual project in city, over here, and an individual project in a city over here, you can achieve economies of scale and achieve buying power to get greater cost reductions for labor forces, for materials, for assets. You can share yards for logistics purposes, for warehousing materials and inventory. You can, hire construction vendors so that they're moving between locations while you're waiting for permits to come out, so that you don't have crews just stopped working, or you have to pay them more to keep them on the job. That, I think, is really the biggest advantage, is that when you're looking at doing these deployments, band together. You can do more together. You can reduce your costs and mitigate those risks and achieve economies of scale.
Wouldn't we have to talk to each other and collaborate to do that?
That is a challenge. I'd say, but the Maryland, I would say the Maryland project, we, like I said, with the collection of the, later I'll tell, if anyone wants to hear the story of playing chicken with the county government over $5 million, or $5,000, I'll tell you. But the truth is that you can do this with proper governance. Even with a simple MOU is all we had in Maryland. We didn't have a legal entity. We just had an MOU and it worked. So,
Thank you. Questions? What would you like to hear the panel talk about?
Raise your hand and we'll walk over to you.
Can't
we
see
go.
you, I'm blinded by the light, but I do see this gentleman over
Great,
here.
thank you. And just identify yourself, if you wouldn't mind.
Steve Stukas with Smart Fiber Networks. I think we were together down in Southern California a couple weeks ago with UTOPIA. My question was for Mr. Higgins. With any of the regional areas you're working with, has there been much talk about dig once programs and micro-trenching requirements? So we do a lot of work with different cities and municipalities around California, and they each seem to want this, but they don't know how to go about it, and they get different consultants in and give them sort of ways to go in different directions, but really that just adds a whole nother layer to go build a network somewhere.
I know, for example, many of you in the room know Sunny McPeak, and she champions Tulare County Association of Governments, who had a model Dig Once program way back when, before it was cool. And there's a little bit of a capacity issue on that, for particularly in the smaller ones that want to do that. And then there's the issue is too, because the region can do it, but then the local agency, the city or county itself, has to actually say, okay, we're going to do that. So there's a degree of separation. I mean, you can encourage that, but that still requires 3 votes on a Tuesday night at a city council to get it done, and that doesn't always happen. Sorry, that's not an optimistic answer for you, probably.
While we're waiting for other questions, I want to ask one. I'd love to get the panelists' thoughts on pole attachments and conduits, and what are the maybe state-specific issues around pole attachments and rights-of-way in California that you have to deal with.
You want to start, Roger?
Well, I mean, I've dealt with a lot of pole attachment issues. I've even been involved in lawsuits related to that, where we tried to attach to some, it was Quest at the time, which, so this was a while back, right? And they wouldn't, process our stuff. Everything was good. They had a timeline. They didn't respond. And some of our contractors went ahead and attached, which you can't do that either. And so then we were in violation. And so you get it, especially when there's a hostile owner of poles that doesn't want you on them. That happens, right? They can cause trouble and delay, and even, what do you do? What recourse do you have when they're not responding and they don't want you to, or you need to do pole replacements and things? Are like, well, we would do this and you're willing to pay the fee, but we just don't have the resources to keep up with you, right? That's often a problem where you go in there. I mean, you can't walk in and say, hey, here's 20,000 pole attachment permit requests. We expect these to get turned around in a couple weeks, right? I mean, you can very easily overwhelm a utility just with the volume of it, and yet, you want to get this thing built. And so from a state perspective, it's helpful to have rules for, what they have to do to comply and allow for third party and be reasonable with all of that. But then you also need to stick when they don't comply. It happens all the time where, we expect to get approvals and there's no good reason, there's no valid reason, they just can't keep up. And we often will do underground builds here and there just because we can't get a response that we need from the utility provider. And it's unfortunate and difficult, but we do a lot more underground than we would like because of the inability of the electrical utilities to keep up with this.
So the poles are different rules per jurisdiction, or you mentioned the state?
Per owner.
Per owner. I mean, even in the same city, we might have a couple of CenturyLink poles and a couple of, city-owned poles. We might have some, power utility poles. On one pathway, you can end up having to deal with several different companies to attach to a route.
There's a federal regulatory scheme that governs pole attachments, but it really only applies to certain types of carriers. So if you're a municipal government, for example, and you want to build a network, you may not have pole attachment rights. And so it's incumbent on the owner of the pole to, out of the goodness of their heart, grant you access to the poles, and you may not have the ability to fairly negotiate a reasonable contract, just hypothetically. So, it's really dependent on who owns the poles, who the carrier is that's seeking. There's going to be fees for attaching to a pole. There are fees for make ready. If you have to replace a pole, that is usually an unreasonable cost that gets passed on to you as the last attacher. And so the net of that is that for builds, yes, it's convenient when you can put fiber and equipment on telephone utility poles. It's not always financially feasible.
But that's not specific to California,
No.
right? These pole issues.
Not at all.
Okay.
Yep. Jonathan Changus with the Center for Sustainable Energy, although technically today on my own time as a member of the public. Broadband is not my wheelhouse, but permit streamlining is certainly not a foreign topic. And so question is, model ordinance that SCAG and SANDAG are coming together with is a good step, but as you noted, Fort Bragg bill is not the same as Pasadena. We know that there's a lot of interest in not just broadband, but streamlining everything. Electric vehicle charging infrastructure is more my wheelhouse. And so that creates real pressure for the permitting office in local government. So what's the solution then? Obviously, the desired outcome is a permitting process that's reliable in terms of timing and where the costs are relatively dependable, and there's not a lot of variety across the state. But in short of a mandate, which I don't think has any political viability, how do we help the Fort Braggs that don't benefit from a regional effort? Are there ways to adapt the model ordinance? Are there additional resources? What's the next step? How do we get out of this being a persistent problem to being something that can be solved?
You want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I like the answer. You know, I think of where it goes well and where it doesn't go well, and a lot of it's relationships. I mean, if the jurisdiction that's giving permits says, hey, this is going to be great for our community, we want you to deploy broadband here, then things go very well. If we're dealing with, you know, our competitor, because they own some poles, it goes very badly. And in some cases, we have competitors who work very well with us, right? Like some of them just, they understand. I mean, they're in the same position sometimes when they're trying to work with their competitor and they have an obstacle and they say, hey, you know, it's just better for everybody if we can have a healthy co-opetition type, you know, model. But, you know, it would be nicer if rules and laws would just make all of this stuff work perfectly all the time. But you know, the practical reality is that it's often a big effort to just sit down with the right people and have a conversation and make sure we're all aligned. You know, well, you have all these layers of check boxes and things. Like, what can we do? Like, how do we work through this? How can we improve the process? You know, how many submissions over what time is reasonable? You know, what format do you want for this? How do we make your job easier so that you can make our job easier, and sit down and work that out? And then suddenly things go well. As far as like cramming down an ordinance or a law or something that kind of forces all that, I mean, like, I'm for it. You know, maybe that sounds harsh. It can't hurt. But again, the practical reality is that I've seen that we end up having to do a lot of just sit down and negotiate and develop relationships with those that we are dependent on for permits.
And I'm going to go back to like the purpose of the permit, because I know you want streamlining for all these good things, but if a developer was coming in with a sprawl, gas-powered, whatever, I would bet that you would want all the permits and CEQA there to stop it. And so sometimes the value of the permit is, or the beauty of the permit is in the eye of the applicant or our opponent. I just make that point because people are all over the differences on that. One thing that does occur to me is, and this is a career of watching local government elected officials, or do we have any in the room? So we can talk about them. No, I have a board of local elected officials. I appreciate their commitment to public service, and they are by nature competitive, and they like, you know, the storyline that they brought money into the local agency while they're there. And, you know, for all the millions we're investing into fiber and everything, there's probably hundreds of thousands that you could put out there in like local agency grants to update your permit to do this, and this, or your process to do this, and this function. That's the requirement. So there's an outcome base that's guaranteed out of it. And they get the story that, hey, we got money from the state to do more broadband. That's a great story for them, right? And so maybe there's some strategies like that where you can help nudge the Pasadenas, because we know that Fort Bragg's got it all together, into place.
That's not happening now.
I don't know. I just came up with that idea. These guys probably know better. Right?
Sounds good.
We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Steve Corbett. I'm from Link, Oregon. I'm also a former Utah, and so I'll do a shout out to Roger. My question goes back to the fundamental premise of this panel. Are the costs higher in California due to wildfire or other geotechnical risk mitigation requirements or strategies that have to take place here?
So I can't speak to whether there's an added cost in California from a regulatory standpoint. So I live in Colorado, and I live in one of the town that was decimated by fire 2 years ago. And we lost 10% of our homes in 12 hours. And it was not a wildfire. It happened outside of town in 130 mile an hour wind gusts. And the fiber optic cable in our town melted, and it was underground. And so the cost to rebuild is challenging, right? And we're looking at sensors, we're looking at other things for detection, for all sorts of technology and how to build that into the plan, the rebuild plan, right? And so the BEAD program layers on a climate aspect of this. And for any BEAD applicant, you're gonna have to look at floodplains, you're gonna have to look at climate change and how that may impact your network, and for disaster recovery. There are states like Louisiana that's building in extra points on your application if you can talk about critical resiliency and disaster recovery. And so I don't think that that's particularly unique to California. I think because there are other states where this is an issue, and anyone who's smart is going to build that into their network plan. So I don't think there are any particular extra costs associated with this for California, but it's something that should be considered by everybody.
One more question over here. Greg?
Hi, my name is Cash Marquardt, and I'm a student at West Campus High School in Sacramento, and also the Student Sustainability Liaison for Sacramento City Unified School District. So as a high schooler, I'm always thinking for the future, and I was wondering your opinion if there are any ways for future city planners or urban developers to mitigate the challenges of broadband construction in urban areas. Like, are there strategies to make it easier for this infrastructure to be built in these cities?
I mean, my opinion, and maybe I'm biased because I'm in the municipal fiber space, is it's really easy for the city to do it, right? If the city is putting in, whether they go all in with the whole system or they're even putting in conduit with every project and then making that conduit available to private companies, or put in conduit and fiber and then make it available on an open access basis. I mean, there's a lot of levels that government can do, or local governments can do, to facilitate broadband in their cities. And I absolutely, my opinion is you should never build a road or any pathway in your city for utilities without putting in a multi-path conduit, which is one that has multiple conduits within a conduit, so that you have future-proofing in that area. You don't have to come back and tear it up. I mean, your conduit costs, depending on what you get, are anywhere from like 30 cents to $1 a foot, depending on the complexity and size of your conduits. And to put it in a trench that's already open because you're building other things, it's almost free. And if you use, if the city has people who can go put it in, it is, very inexpensive. You come in later and you're talking, it could be $20 to $40 a foot to drill something in. Some contractors out there would be like, well, we're way less than that or something. But you add all the layers of projects and things like that, you can see some pretty high costs to come in and retrofit an area or overbuild an area that's already been cleaned up, and you're going to have to do restoration and all the other work. So, yeah,
I think
cities put it in.
I think that's the OG answer.
Lori? Couldn't agree more.
Nailed it,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, our time has expired. Please say thank you to our terrific panel.
Thanks for coming all the way.
California Broadband Summit, and then we'll roll right into the rest of the CalMatters Ideas Festival. So enjoy your break at 3 o'clock sharp. Thank you, everyone.